Thank you very much for coming. I'm extremely glad to launch this new seminar series, the Paris-Cambridge Exchange Seminar. Attending today is the very first session, so thank you for doing this effort, for coming. It's not an easy thing to make two traditions of thought like that converse and exchange, because we have two rather different ways of doing prehistory, of thinking archaeology. To tell you the truth, the back of the story is that when I moved from Paris to Cambridge 3 years ago for my first postdoc, I was aware about these differences, but even though I was prepared, I experienced this kind of intellectual jet lag. And I wanted to reconcile in my brain these two ways of viewing things. Otherwise, this could have led me to schizophrenia. So this idea of the seminar is to exchange between our two traditions and also to anticipate a bit the future direction our practices could have by exchanging and discussing on our respective practices. So this seminar session is the golden opportunity to see if there is virtually quite no exaggeration in the statement I had coming here, or if we share more than it looks. This seminar is a new initiative in its form, but the intellectual exchange is not new. Besides individual collaborations, I have had several echoes of such kind of exchanges. In the team Ethnologie Préhistorique, François Audouz told me that Sander van der Leeuw, while he was lecturer in Cambridge from the mid-80s to the mid-90s, organized such a seminar between the University of Cambridge and l'Université Paris. He invited François Audouz, but also French famous archaeologists like Jean-Paul Demoule, Annick Coudard, Serge Clesiou, Pierre Lemonet, Augustin Holl, etc. And Cyprien Broodbent also told me that Nathan Schlanger, when he was a Cambridge student, had the idea also to organize such kind of seminar, but he was discouraged by the administrative complexity, which is a very French specialty. I have been able myself to measure such difficulties as it took me 2 years to make it happen, but finally we are here today together, and I want to express my warmest thanks to the institution and people who made it possible: the European Union under the program H2020, the McDonald Institute for Archaeological Research, Cyprien and Sally, Emma, Trish, Laurie, thank you very much for the support. The research team Ethnologie Préhistorique at the CNRS, with which the exchange is made, Pierre Baudu, Ludovic Mével, François Villeneuve, and all the people of the Maison Archéologie et Ethnologie at Nanterre. I want to thank without reservation our speakers today who accepted to launch the seminar. It's not an easy exercise. Fiona Kildea, Enrico Crema, and Christopher Evans. And also I want to thank the speakers of the forthcoming sessions. In this room today we have the chance to have Graham Barker and Luc Moreau, so thank you very much also for coming today. Many thanks also to the Alliance Française de Cambridge, represented by its director Patricia Dalby, for circulating the information. With the spectrum of the Brexit, it's a good timing to strengthen the existing links between our academic communities. Today we start with a session on the topic of data and big data in prehistory, even though in France you will never hear about big data in prehistory or in archaeology. It's a kind of other word. And we will see different ways of handling it. For that we have fantastic speakers, both dealing, no, it's not exaggerating, both dealing with large quantities of data in their everyday practice. Fiona is research engineer at the French National Institute for Preventive Archaeology, which is called the INRA. You will hear about this many times. Her daily job is mainly conducting fieldwork, surveys and excavation in central France. She has been dealing with very complex stratigraphies and large quantities of data. Enrico is lecturer here in computational analysis for archaeology at the University of Cambridge, and he has been involved and is involved in such a quantity of large projects that it's in itself a kind of big data. They are both representative of different manners of considering and handling data. They will probably say themselves they are on both sides of the chessboard, dealing very differently and doing very different things. However, we should avoid caricature because Fiona is not a French native and Enrico is not a UK native. So we finally have the chance to have Christopher Evans, the Executive Director of the Cambridge Archaeological Unit. He is without doubt the best placed person to put their respective approaches in perspective, and he has kindly agreed to act as chairman today. He will lead the debate after the presentation. Thank you very much. So let's start with Fiona's talk.
Wow. Thank you very much for welcoming me here. I would like to thank especially our host, Emmanuelle Honoré, who has organized this binational series of exchange seminar held in Paris and Cambridge. I am myself binational, born in England but raised in France. Although I am considered a very British person in France, you may think quite differently once you hear me speak English without reading my text. So please let me apologize for doing so. The French research team Ethnologie Préhistorique brings together researchers from different institutions, the French National Centre of Scientific Research, CNRS, universities, cultural heritage state services, and rescue archaeology companies or institutions. I have been working since 1994 for the French National Institute of Prevention, INRAP, let's say, in the region of the Loire Valley. This works. I received an academic training from Professor Boris Valentin and Nicole Pigeot and began at the same time my professional career with Pierre Baudu. My first fieldwork experiences were at Visant, Étiole and Le Closeau, where a same protocol inherited from André Leroy-Gourand was implemented. I have had the chance to excavate Upper Paleolithic and Mesolithic sites, mainly in the context of major land management projects such as motorways or railways. The cost of Paleolithic archaeology is most often so high that the smaller projects are simply abandoned when concerned by such a site. Therefore, I have led only 3 excavations the past 10 years. As you can guess, my work consists also in evaluating the archaeological potential of areas concerned by various development projects. I try to mostly work in the valleys where Pleistocene sequences are more likely to be preserved. This is what we call opération de diagnostic, survey, I guess, in England. So I called it evaluation, I think. Well, exactly. The rest of my time I study lithic artifacts from excavations, but more often evaluations conducted by colleagues. I have to shift my text, sorry. The working context of rescue archaeology is very peculiar as everything seems big. The team, the dimensions of the sites, the timescale and the mechanization of part of the excavation. I use also hydraulic diggers. The use of hydraulic diggers was developed massively by rescue archaeology, and I believe that one of the main effects of the use of this technique is the increase of the volume of data. It is only since 15 years that major technical improvements have flourished, and they concern the way the data is collected and how it is treated. When I began my professional career with Pierre Baudu, on the site of Le Closeau, the entire methodology was directly inherited from André Leroy-Gourand and Pincevent. A grid marking out the open area excavation was implemented by following an existent physical limit, and the archaeological remains were located within square meters. Hand drawing took a large place in the everyday activities. Altimetry measurements were reported for each artifact, and we made quite a lot of mouldings of flint knapping spots. The quality of the records were great for assessing the structural organization of fabulously well-preserved Paleolithic campsites. In the case of sites less well-preserved, or with a complex succession of settlements, it was much more difficult to characterize the geometry and the taphonomy of the archaeological levels, and therefore to be certain of their integrity, as the 3D data would be available only after a drastic amount of work, the coordinates of each artifact needing to be calculated. We will see how technological improvements have been useful for the comprehension of an extraordinarily rich open-air Paleolithic site. With the georeferencing of all archaeological and geological finds, we can now have access to a range of data not even expected 20 years ago. The records are referenced within the national metric grid called Lambert, and it is the most commonly used in archaeology in France. Each artifact is recorded in 3 dimensions within the Lambert grid, as well as the reference points of geological cross-sections. The entire geological level is also documented by georeference photographic coverage, which can be used as a base for graphic illustration of the finds, as the example shown. Or for the replication of the archaeological level for pedagogical purposes, thanks to the photogrammetric treatment of the documentation. The georeference database is completed by technological and typological codified observations, as well by series of measurements. The database that I use has 22 criterions that are not necessarily applied to every artifact, especially in the case of fragmented pieces. The database is completed by geological and stratigraphic descriptions. This geographic information system is obviously a great support for the study of Paleolithic sites. The development of this recording method is still not systematic, though. The degree of preservation specific to each Paleolithic site is a first-range factor in view to decide which method would be the most appropriate. It could indeed be considered as useless for archaeological entities in an evident secondary position. But we will see the contrary also in this paper. The excavation of the prehistoric site of Paris.Ce in 2005 yielded an opportunity for me to test these new methods, although this was not originally planned. In fact, the prescription of this excavation by the Cultural Heritage State Services was motivated by the detection of a large Mesolithic site. 1,500 square meters, or if you prefer, 1,800 square yards, were to be explored by systematic sieving of the sediment, and as the archaeological remains were scattered within a layer 30 to 50 centimeters thick. The right of way, I don't know how to say emprise, right of way, something you say? Where we do the excavation, the limits.
Oh, well, limits of excavation.
Limits, yeah. Within the limits. Well, they included an area of 1.5 hectare, or 2.5 acres. As the Mesolithic site was poorly documented, our plan was to do 1 square meter test pits at a distance of 10 meters from one another, lined up on the Lambert grid. We had previously proceeded this way on a nearby Mesolithic site, Saint-Romain-sur-Cher. This method proved to be an efficient way to assess Mesolithic campsites poorly preserved in sandy context. The results were highly valuable as the question as they questioned the reality of the regional Mesolithic cultural group identified by Dr. Rozoy in the 70s, the Beaugensiens. This group was characterized by the large size of the sites and very abundant lithic artifacts, which could include more than 10,000 cores, mostly in sandy context. The site of Saint-Romain revealed that Beaugensien sites were in fact diachronic and belonging to diverse cultural influence, such as Buronien and Sauveterrien. The confirmation of such results were expected at Marie-sur-Cher. But mechanical prospection within the limits revealed that an upper Paleolithic site was also preserved, and more preoccupying, that several archaeological layers were observed within 1.5 meters of stratigraphy. A partially destructive mechanical test proved formally the succession of distinct occupation within the Paleo Channel. So this is a video that didn't work yesterday. So I can give it a try. So I have 3 videos that won't work. So I get out and I show you them from here, okay? If you don't mind. So we could, at this point, only imagine how important could be the archaeological record in this linear geological formation. So that's the fit. So I'll go back. Sorry. The 2 others videos, sorry. Therefore, after the team had only seen 30 test pits, the heritage curator in charge with the scientific control of the excavation agreed that we should change our priorities and document the Paleolithic settlements. So that ended the Mesolithic excavation. During the 5 next months, the team increased up to 40 people between October and March. There. The identification of Mesolithic artifacts scattered over a large area had occulted the importance of the Pleistocene sequence preserved below. This figure shows the location of the evaluation trenches in the Paleo Channel and the unique Paleolithic spot found there then, and it is just here. And so you can see the ditch figured here, it's this one, and they only saw 1 or 2 lithic artifacts here. As you can see, reported it here. The methods adopted for the Mesolithic excavation had to be drastically adapted to this specific configuration. Although the prescription indicated that every particular find, such as a flint knapping spot or a fireplace, should be hand-drawn, we decided to realize instead a systematic photographic cover of every square meter excavated. A serial number related to the lumber grid was given to each artifact. It associates the 3 last numbers of the metric coordinate system, x and y, to a number from 1 to n within each square meter. Each area of the excavation has its own number and is called a locus. These entities are supposed to each be related to a distinctive Paleolithic settlement, but in practice, this didn't turn out right. In fact, two adjacent locus, separated by the town's sewage system, yielded 4 consecutive settlements. The sequence's record is unfortunately different in each locus, although the settlements are all present on both sides. For example, locus 8 level 1 is equivalent to of locus 9 level 2, and etc. As the digging needed to progress at a sustained pace, Systematic stratigraphic controls couldn't take place. As we constantly had to rush, we assumed that the georeferencing of each artifact would guarantee a minimal quality of the information collected. One of the important goals of the Mesolithic excavation was to document the geomorphological context of the human settlement. Even though the priorities had changed, the goal remained the same. And in this perspective, 3 very deep trenches were to be dug following a symmetric plan. Many areas remain unexcavated, despite all our efforts. Nevertheless, at least 14 different phases were identified. More than 60,000 artifacts were recorded in the database, and even more were collected by the frequent sieving of the sediment. Once at a stage of studying the site, we had to give up the idea of being exhaustive. The Locus 15 was left unstudied as it seemed contemporaneous of the nearby Locus 8 and 9, but much less well preserved. To ensure the formal distinction between each level and therefore the constitution of homogeneous lithic entities, we used AutoCAD and Covadis logiciel, to visualize in 3 dimensions the data. And although the team's topographer, geometrician, do you say topographer? Yeah, it's okay. Suggested at the time that the use of ArcGIS would be very convenient, I thought that its graphic restitution was too poor and that the benefits were not that obvious. There was a big mistake. Treating the data in view to individualize specifically the different origination levels cost a tremendous time, while inventorying, measuring and describing the flints of each square meter, I had to control the stratigraphic position of each one of them. We mainly achieved that goal by looking back, but looking back, we lost considerable time by proceeding this way. The 3 successive Aurignacian settlements of Locus 8 and 9 were explored at the base of the Paleo Channel. They were separated by 10 to 20 centimeters of sediment. The distribution of the artifacts seemed very well preserved on each level. This observation was confirmed by technological and typological analysis of each lithic assemblage, as well by the tri-dimensional and spatial approach. Several fireplaces have been identified, although their presence is only indicated by minute organic remains such as charcoal or carbonized bone fragments, as well as by the spatial distribution of artifacts around these spots, especially tools and heated flints. A same pattern of organization. I'm sorry, I think I missed something. This is the fireplace, with only the charcoal and the bones. A same pattern of organization is shared by each Aurignacian level. Most important flint knapping spots are nearby the fireplaces, as well as specific categories of tools. Backed bladelets, lamelles du four, burins, retouched or notched flakes share more or less the same distribution near fireplaces. Retouched blades and scrapers are, on the contrary, at a good distance from the fire. This pattern is adopted by the earliest and the latest Aurignacian levels, and so can be interpreted as domestic sites. So the level inserted between these 2 settlements, so this is what is showing now, is more likely to be a specialized camp, as no bladelet production is attested. On the contrary, the most recent settlement is largely dedicated to such a production, a stock of small blocks of raw material having even been found nearby a flint knapping spot. Technological characteristics are shared by the lithic production of the two most recent settlements, both from the classic phase. The oldest campsite is more likely to be dated from the proto-Aurignacian, considering the blade and bladelet production and typological specificities. At that stage, the chronology and the function of the three main Aurignacian settlements were identified, but the extension of each one of them, and therefore the real special structuration of each campsite, was still unknown. It is only in 2016, 8 years after, much too far. So it was only in 2016, 8 years after the editing of the report, that I had the opportunity to work again on the data of Paris.Ce. The unstudied locus 15 couldn't stay so. During 2 weeks, I started to inventory the presumed Aurignacian industries. This time, I had learned to use ArcGIS, and more specifically, Arcene. The first time I used the locus 15 database, I could immediately visualize the different archaeological levels and the areas poorly preserved. I could also identify a small but coherent level beneath the Aurignacian settlements. As you can see, the purple level here. Thanks to the use of Arcene, I was able to select directly on my screen the 350 lithic elements constituting this unknown level. No, not from the first time. Okay. This one. So that's done. This one. So I was able to select directly on my screen the 350 lithic elements constituting this unknown level and have access to all their references. This level was identified and recorded in the last week of the excavation while checking the area with the hydraulic digger. The systematic photographic coverage was at that time less effective, but I found some images of the flint knapping spots. So I have 3 pictures of, it's there, here, you can see the level, and Aurignacian preserved here and there. The study is to be continued, but we have evidence that these spots are very brief knapping spots of the numerous refittings show that the best blades left the site, although no particular tool has yet been identified. The technological characteristic of the industry indicates a Chatterperonian age. Still in the Paleochannel, and first to have been excavated, was a very complex archaeological level that turned out to be cryoturbed and soliflucted. So, it's the last one, promised. So you can see it's the purple unit here that has been cryoturbed and soliflucted. So you can see on the following video how dilated the level is and the non-anthropic acreoles accumulations. So although the taphonomy is very poor, the lithic assemblage is very interesting as it yielded many burins, des burins de nouailles, burins of nouailles, which are gradation, and absolutely no burin de race. So it is quite a French problematic. I understand that quite easily. These two types of burins, or rather bladelet cores for the latest, are very often associated together in the shelter and cave sequences of the southwest of France. The nearby site of La Picardie, studied by Laurent Claric, suggested that the association of both types of objects was only the result of palimpsest. The gravation industry of Marais tends to confirm this idea. On another level, so in red you can see the Burin de Noailles in the level. So it's saying that tri-dimensional record could not be used for not well-preserved site, but in fact when you see the precision of what we can obtain on this campsite, it's quite the contrary. On another level, we observe that two categories of Burin Noailles could be individualized, the typical and the atypical. I was told there is no such thing as atypical Burin Noailles, as the definition is very clear and based on large series from the southwest of France. But our observation made convergence with a particular spatial distribution of les Burin Noailles and the back points, les points de la gravette and microgravette. Given the poor condition of preservation, it is astonishing to notice that a very large majority of the typical Burin Noailles are located in the center of the locus, although the back points are specially associated with the atypical Burin Noailles, nearby the presumed fireplace, that was partially destroyed by the mechanical digger. This question needs to be more discussed, and the integrity of the assemblage is not assured. Evidence of diachronic elements should be sought. Another gravation settlement was identified in another area of the excavation. The paleo channel in the north of the dig yielded close to 40,000 artifacts on a total of more than 60,000. Two other topographic entities were identified, well, in fact, two with archaeological records. The recent dell generated by the plateau above is younger than 40,000 years, as it was formed after the filling of the old dell dated by Nick Debenham from 59 up to 41,000. The other topographic unit is the sandy alluvial plain. The late gravation settlement that was the Burin de Noailles, up. So this is the new one, the recent gravation. So the late gravation settlement was preserved on the north slope of the recent dell and made its detection with a hydraulic digger quite tricky. As you can see, there is a discontinuity between flint knapping spot at the top of the fireplace and the fireplace below, but refittings were this is exhausting. I hope it's okay for you. But refittings were successfully made amongst artifacts of both areas, demonstrating the contemporaneous status of the finds. Only a portion of the settlement was excavated, but our observations tend to show that the main area of the campsite was uncovered. Its function is a hunting bivouac. As a hunting bivouac seems clear, as the activities appear to be exclusively the production of regular straight blades and their immediate transformation in gravette points, although the presence of organic remains could have changed considerably our interpretation. Another remarkable find was made in the plain valley immediately under the sandy unit with the Mesolithic find. Two probable contemporaneous settlements were excavated on a total surface of 200 square meters. The archaeological level is drastically different from all the previous one, as many built fireplaces are present and a great amount of heated stones is scattered around them. In 2005, we focused on the characterization of the industry for evident chronological purposes. Thanks to the systematic sieving of the sandy soil, we gathered over 350 backed microbladlets from an early stage of the Magdalenian. Our goals were also to precise the taphonomy and therefore the unity of the assemblages, especially as the presence of regular blades seemed incoherent. Our projection showed a probable succession of two settlements. A PhD student is working on this early Magdalenian campsite in a technological and spatial functional perspective. If I still have time, is it okay? Yes. So maybe not. So I can show you the complexity of a succession of middle Magdalenian settlements on the south slope. So not to go in the details, but I will just show you that we are on the other side, on the other slope of the dell. And then after the first, as the industries are quite similar, middle Magdalenian, this first settlement, which is quite well preserved in this part, was eroded by the dell itself, the activity of the dell. But as soon as the other group came with nearly the same industry, the dell was completely filled. So they were not able to see it in the environment. The dell has nearly completely disappeared in the environment. So there are classic fireplaces for the Magdalenian, and refitting show only very short distant move on the upper settlements, the earliest, I'm not reading my text, so it's just, sorry. The upper level reveals a rather brief stay with few knapping spots and very light fireplaces. Refitting show only very short distance move and the absence of the most regular blades. So as you can notice, my approach of the prehistoric data is rather practical. The context of rescue archaeology has probably increased this way of approaching Paleolithic problematics. I hope nevertheless that you enjoy to discover the site of Marie-sur-Cher as much as I enjoy being here with you today. Thank you very much.
We can actually go with the second talk and we will do questions and debate afterwards.
Yeah, should be fine. Hopefully. Right. Right. Firstly, Emmanuelle, thank you so much for organizing this. It's very exciting. It's also it's the first time somebody asked me to talk about big data, actually. So let's see how much I can go through this. So let's start with definitions, right? Actually, no. Let's first give you an outline of what I'm planning to talk today. So first I want to distinguish between big data and synthetic data, because I think what I do is mostly synthetic data and not big data, and precisely in relation to the definition of what big data is. Then I will basically dedicate the whole talk to promote the approach of synthetic research, promote the approach of data recycling. And then, of course, I will see the negative side of this, about the pitfalls of synthetic data, through 3 stories. Some of them are more anecdotal evidence, but it's throughout my career I've been falling every time I started to use synthetic data to find solutions to each of these. And then the last bit will be about what can we do for the future of this kind of approach. So let's start with definition. Now, if you search big data, there's so many different definitions. But one of the most common type is someone like this one by Bloomberg, a massive volume of both structured and unstructured data that is so large that it's difficult to process using traditional database and software techniques. Now, if you use this definition, the great majority of big data in archaeology is not big, right? If you can, even if you have a database with 50,000 entries, if you can actually use your computer to query it, that's not big data. The only kind of true big data we have, following this bit of the definition, are either 3D data, genomic data, remote sensing data. Those are the big chunks in archaeology where you really have to use specific machines. Just to give you an example, the two RAIN projects that is currently working on India, they are dealing with large remote sensing data that cannot be handled with a normal computer. They had to use high-performance computing facilities here in Cambridge that uses machines with 2 terabytes of RAM. Okay, so if you are familiar with computing, that's quite extraordinary. But most of archaeological data don't follow under this category. But what we have here is that within the definition of big data, there's also this idea of unstructured data. Right? Big data is also messy, and this is something that actually is relevant to smaller kind of archaeological data. And that's what I refer to synthetic research and synthetic data. If I have to give a definition, is when we're dealing with data that are collected by other people for other original purposes. Right? So we always face the situation where somebody gives you a nice spreadsheet that was collected as part of a CRM research or as part of another project. You pick up this data and you try to ask a different question. Right? There's all sorts of cases and all sorts of structure and ways you find this kind of data. So this might be coming from large collation coming from CRM, some cultural resource management. This might be existing outputs from specific academic excavation or projects. You might find them as part of a archaeological data service or somewhere in a structured format online. You might find it as portable antiquity schemes. Maybe Chris, you will probably talk about portable antiquity schemes, right? Or you might have basically something like the Canadian Archaeological Radiocarbon Database, which is actually a collation of collation, right? Or if you are unlucky, if it's my case, you might have them just in printed excavation records, which is pretty much, my PhD was just going and drowning under these non-digital data sets, and was just a matter of trying to digitize and trying to get something like this, right? So why we have to do synthetic research, right? Part of the reason is that there are certain kind of questions that can be answered only through this kind of data. I work on settlement archaeology, and I look at the larger scale regional patterns, right? So if I have one extra excavation, that doesn't change. It's an extra sample point in my analysis. So what I really need is lots of excavations done by many people over decades, right? So this kind of questions can be answered only through data that has been collected by others. This is a paper by a number of authors, North American authors in American Antiquity. It lists grand challenges for archaeology. There's a list of topics, and towards the end there's this statement, addressing many of these challenges require both sophisticated modeling and large-scale synthetic research that are only now becoming possible. Right? Because we have enough of these data as they're becoming finally accessible. There's an additional line saying that we should be doing also computational archaeology, but I removed that. That was too much self-promotion. Second reason why we should be doing synthetic research, it's that archaeological data are finite resources, right? Another paper from American Antiquity, not that I'm promoting this, with a very catchy title, The End of Archaeological Discovery. So what they did, this is a group of authors working in North America, mainly from, I think Todd Sorrell was working in Wyoming originally, was to look at the frequencies of findings in different types of archaeological data across the world, and primarily in the North America, and making basically a forecasting model of how much more stuff we can still find. And of course, depending on the type of data, the predictions are different. If you're looking at shipwrecks, there is a huge decline. It's very likely that we exhausted the resources. It's unlikely that we'll find that many more shipwrecks. If you're looking at European Upper Paleolithic, good news, that's not declining too much. It's more or less stable. But the idea here is that, of course, depending on the kind of things that we're looking after, all of them are finite. right? There will be a point in the future where we will no longer find new Neanderthal bones. So we have to start to look at what we've collected so far. Third reason why we should be caring about this, and this is specifically from the perspective, in my case, from Japanese archaeology, is that we spend already so much in terms of human economic resources. This is showing a graph of the number of rescue excavations in Japan and the millions I converted this in pounds because in yen you have extraordinarily huge numbers. And if you look at the peak in the late 90s, it's nearly £1 billion British pounds spent in a single year. Okay? This is not adjusted from inflation, but you can see the figures are extraordinarily high. The number of excavations in the mid-90s reached 12,000 per year. It declined after the economic crisis in the mid-90s in Japan, but it's always stable around 8,000 excavations per year. Right? This is extraordinary. If you're doing settlement archaeology, this is a great data set, if you can access this. As I said earlier, they are in printed material and not necessarily in the digital format. But we also have a moral responsibility to use this data because we spend so much on this and people have been working so hard on this. And they shouldn't be just laying on books in a dusty library. Right, so what are the pitfalls? The good news, of course, is hopefully I convince you that data recycling and synthetic research is important. It can answer any questions, and we have an ethical responsibility to work on this. The bad news is that because it's synthetic research, and especially if you're dealing with multiple nations, different periods, you're dealing with different standards, different research traditions, different sampling strategies, different quality of data, etc., etc. So, especially if you're dealing with regional studies, where you are looking at the larger spectrum of research tradition, even within the same country, it's likely that you'll find some bias, right? You'll find some bias and you'll find some noise. But if you're wearing the statistician's hat, noise is everywhere, that's not the problem. As long as the noise is random and the statistic is exactly there for that. The ugly is that these are not random noise, they tend to follow patterns. And often they tend to tend interesting patterns. And that's the big problem, right? So if you step back from this and look at the whole big picture, more data means that we have more patterns, right? There's a higher chance to find spurious correlation. And, I wanted to show something different from a correlation between autism and organic food sales. You can find plenty of these random correlation that most people will say, well, that's pointless. I mean, as long as you don't fall into these kind of belief, it's fine. But the problem is that we intuitively see patterns everywhere. This is a picture of the famous Mars face, right? And it's 2017. There are plenty of new images of the same picture showing that it's a random picture, but you can still find websites about Viking face light angle data overlay and saying that they found new evidence actually from the latest imagery that there are evidence of blocks in Martian civilizations. Now, this might be extreme because this is absurd, but if it's something not absurd, we'll start to see something interesting going on. And that's my first case study, actually. I unfortunately don't have the actual data I got at the time. This was my very first undergrad dissertation project. I was working on Japan on the east side of the Tokyo Bay, working on Jomon hunter-gatherers. And I was excited to find that there's so many excavated data set. I was working, my undergrad dissertation, I was at the University of Bologna. I couldn't basically have a field project in Japan, so the only kind of project I could possibly do on Japanese archaeology was based on existing material, on published records. So I started to look at the data, and one interesting series of papers that were published in this area was these differences between the coastal side of the settlements and the more inland sides. And there were differences in terms of fauna, and differences in terms of material culture, etc., etc. So I was really excited to see whether there's any other differences that I can detect. And one thing that one colleague at that time was a professor, suggested, why don't you look at the pit house depth of the pit? And he started to say, well, maybe there is, if there are complete different subsistence settlement pattern, maybe there is a pattern there. And maybe because you have different investment on digging a hole of 3 meters versus a hole of 20 centimeters, that's actually related to the stability of the residential pattern. That's a cool, interesting research. So I started to collect these data, and that's the thing that unfortunately I cannot show you. And what I noticed there was a clear pattern. There was I forgot which side was which, but I think the coastal side had a deeper pit and the inland side has a much shallower pit. So that's a nice narrative. Different subsistence economy, different settlement pattern, different type of pit houses. And then I talked to a local archaeologist, and that's the key point. I talked to a local CRM archaeologist, and I got so excited. I see this pattern. I want to do this thing called regression analysis. All this excitement, and he says, "Oh, yeah, you shouldn't work on that." It's like, how come? It's so exciting. He said, "Well, the problem is that Japanese excavations are highly extensive, so they excavate the whole archaeological site. And what happened is they take a bulldozer, they remove the top layer, and they start to excavate individual pit houses. Now, the person who's in charge of the inland sites, because of course these are administrative regions within this Tokyo Bay, is a guy that is renowned for his abuse of bulldozers. And he basically tend to cut the upper bit of these pit houses. So, because of this specific administrative division, which is based on coastal and inland, there was a pattern generated completely by the fact that there is a guy that tend to use the bulldozer in a bad way. So maybe there was actually a pattern, but this additional bias that tend to match and correlate with a classic coast-inland scenario creates a very strong pattern that will be statistically significant. If you don't know about this, you might end up and publish a paper. And if I didn't hear that tip, yeah, I would probably have done that for my undergrad dissertation. So that's the problem, that there are correlations that are related to the specific kind of bias we might be facing. The second study, case study, comes back to Japanese archaeology. Much later on, during my PhD, I was interested in settlement sites. I come across a paper published in the early 2000s about this distinction between two systems that was named clumped and dispersed. It's basically differences in terms of hierarchy of settlement sizes. So I got interested in settlement sizes. I started to read Robert Brennan and methods to quantify this. Japan is a perfect scenario, perfect context where you can do this kind of research because you have extensive excavations. You can actually count the number of houses. And if you use pottery chronology, you have a good estimate of the settlement size for a rough chronological period. Very exciting. So I went to collect the data. You have the classic distribution of sites and centroids. Then I look at the excavation areas. And that's when I started to get worried. Because there are extensive excavations and sites were defined entirely based on specific events, like I'm building a golf club, and some of these sites actually have names that are obviously related to, that's specific to Japanese archaeology, but they tend to have names like Golf Club Site A, or there's another one that is called Shrimp, but it's actually read in a different way, like because Japanese kanji has different readings, and turns out it was a Red Lobster restaurant. So they have very clever ways of defining the sites, but they are specific to the contingency of the recovery. And so if you look at the extent of the excavation, you see huge variability. And I tried to color code by each site, but in some cases, like this one, actually the excavation areas of this specific site are these three. So they basically surround another site. The problem, of course, is once you start to look at pit house data, you have situations like this. If I look at the individual house, it's more likely that this house is closer to another house on a neighboring site to another site in the very same site. So the definition used in the Japanese CRM archaeology of what constitutes a site doesn't, of course, match what's a settlement. And so if you ignore all of this and you just go back to the point data, assign some count data to each of these and try to do any kind of spatial analysis, you are completely ignoring the contingency on how sites are defined. Now, I don't want to be extreme and go to cite my Robert Daniel on how the notion of site should be discarded in archaeology. This might be too extreme, but certainly in this specific case, the notion of site becomes a problem. So I had to come up with very complicated solutions, like trying to see how much sensitivity there is in the definition of the grouping of these sites. So I had to use a method called DD-scan, which is a clustering algorithm, and basically repeated the same analysis over and over using different definitions of site based on proximity, for instance, of the excavations, and see whether it matters. And this is showing the fluctuation of the pattern between clumped and dispersed. And luckily for most people it doesn't really matter, but for this one in particular, you have a complete different result. So in this case, the definition of site, which we don't have because there's no obvious essentialist definition of what is a settlement, in this case, the way you define what is a site have such a huge impact to completely change the interpretation of the result. Right. The third case study is something very controversial, which is the use of some probability distribution of radiocarbon dates to infer demography. This is extremely trendy, I would say, in archaeology. There's lots of applications. If you never heard about this, the idea is that if there's more people produce more objects. If there's more objects, you have more radiocarbon dates. If you have more radiocarbon dates, you can sum the probability of the radiocarbon dates, and that will give you an idea of variation in terms of population size. Controversial because, of course, this assumption relies on this correlation between number of people, number of object, number of dates. And the very first attempt of this is the original 1987, and this is my third citation from American Antiquity. I should really stop doing this. Already mentions the fact that, of course, there are biases. There's biases in the creation of the objects, depending on different kind of economy. The number of objects that are dateable will be different. There is a problem of preservation. This might be time dependent. This might be artifact type dependent. And of course, there's also an investigation bias. And all three of them have been tackled with different levels of success. But the key point is that this is something that we should be aware, and people have been trying to approach, at least to fix this specific methodology. That said, one of the next step in terms of the application of some probability distribution became, we have lots of data, we have these databases with the coordinates and the C14 data, why we don't do some kind of spatial analysis? And so there have been, in the last really 2-3 years, there have been flourishing a number of papers trying to look at changes in density of C14 dates and looking at this in terms of variation over time. And they produce really nice maps and they tell stories. This is all good and exciting, and I'm not necessarily against the whole approach. The problem is that this is when you really start to suffer the problem of research bias. And the perfect example comes from the US, and I call it the Wyoming problem. This is from the Canadian Archaeological Radiocarbon Database, and this shows the location where these C14 dates are coming from. And if you don't know where Wyoming is this perfect square where you have this huge concentration of radiocarbon dates. If you look at this and look at the density, regardless of whatever period you go, Wyoming will always have a high peak. Unless maybe in the past Wyoming was the center of the American civilization, which probably is unlikely. The reason why Wyoming is densely populated turned out, I thought this was related to Rob Kelly, who's working on Wyoming, so maybe it's the Rob Kelly effect. And it turns out it's not the Rob Kelly effect, it's apparently in Wyoming everything becomes a site every single object you find becomes an archaeological site. They give a point, they give so it's really on the definition of site, which is different between Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and the neighboring states. So this is the same country, yes, different federal states, but the definition of site, and consequently the number C14 associated to different location, matters so much that we'll have a huge peak in a specific location. So how do you overcome this kind of problem? This is a paper I worked over the summer, so this was my summer work. Unfortunately not field work. You simulate this. So you try to evaluate what are the implications of taphonomic bias, or what are the implications in this case of sampling bias. So I had an idea of a specific method. I wasn't sure if the method was working, so what I did was to actually simulate what would happen under a specific demographic curve. You generate an artificial data set, and then you simulate the process of sampling bias. What happens if half my region samples only half of the C14 dates? What happens if they have a different definition of archaeological site? we simulate this and see whether specific methods work. So that's one way to overcome this problem. It's to mimic, it's to integrate the sampling process or the definition of the unit in the analysis itself. But this solution, of course, is based on the fact that I don't have the measure, I don't have the definition of the definition used in a specific context. All I have is I know there's some form of bias which is related in this case to the intensity of dating. A better approach, which is something that is increasingly being used in other fields, especially in ecology, is to actually record these kind of biases in the sampling collection stage and then integrate them in the analytical workflow. So you have a series of papers from accounting spatially biased sampling, bias correction, the effects of sampling bias. All of these papers in ecology, what they do is they quantify, they try to measure what are the effects of sampling bias and actually explore the implications and try to do things from the trending, model selection, and all sorts of approach that takes this into account in a formal fashion. Right, so what can we do? First thing I think that we should be really trying all to focus on is to facilitate and promote, of course, data recycling. All of this works. If more people do data recycling, if more research are based on this kind of analysis, there will be more awareness and there's more interest in actually developing methods or collecting data in a specific way. Classic words, open access, open data, and open methods. All of this has to be widely accessible, but has to be in a way that it's not just you can get the data, it has to be presented in a way that is actually usable, which is a big difference between simply being available doesn't necessarily define something as open. The key thing is to ensure and promote the use of metadata and reproducible research. Metadata is a love note to the future. It's all the information that is some type of information that you might think is secondary and it's related to the data itself. What was the sampling strategy? What are the implications? What are the potential biases? All this kind of information are never on the front load. If you download the spreadsheet, you don't find this information, but that's the information that then can be used for specific type of analysis that trend these effect. We should be discussing more boring things like standards, best practice, data hygiene protocols. Those are the important things that enable this kind of comparison across different kind of data set. We should be really recording biases, admit when we have one, there's nothing wrong with that. As long as you record and report this, that's fine. Explore the implications. This is also part of the discipline. It's not just the creation of the archaeological data, it's also how we collect them and how they get transformed. That's part of archaeology, it's part of our data. And develop suitable methods. And the last thing I want to emphasize is that accessibility itself, and there's a lot of examples of this. There is a dedicated journal of Open Archaeology Data, which is entirely based on data papers. Internet Archaeology now has a special type of submission where you can just publish data paper. The CAA conference has a CAA Recycle Award that goes to the person who made the data available and the person who reused the data. And there are plenty of papers like this one, which I also co-authored about open science. We should be doing open science, but this is not actually new. And the problem is that making things accessible doesn't necessarily mean that they are usable. And that's the key point, right? In order to be usable, there should be a culture of reuse, there should be support for reuse, and there should be incentive for reuse. And so that's the thing that we should be working on. This is just part of the solution, and the second half is really up to all levels, from in terms of education, in terms of research interest, in terms of fundings, to focus on this type of data recycling and synthetic research. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Well, thank you both very much, and I think really stimulating and extremely different in terms of the two approaches. A very elegant, high precision use of data that we've seen on the French Paleolithic sites, and I find it very intriguing for Enrico's idea of this whole idea of data recycling. I must admit, I haven't really thought about it much myself, and the implications of it. I'm interested slightly between what you think the relationship is between your two papers. Yes, and also what tradition currently, for example, is in INRAP in terms of what level of high synthetic study that there would be at this point. How much overviewing and data analysis at between the site level and at a regional level would currently be undertaken?
Well, there are quite a few projects. In fact, with INRAP, they try to develop research projects. They usually are with INRAP researchers, but also collaborate with CNRS and university. And they are projects that go beyond the region scale.
Yes.
But never at a European scale, so rarely. So we still have the limits of the frontiers, but we do have some projects. Well, rather many. We have the PCR collective research projects that exist integrate INRAP archaeologists also. And we have independent research programs in INRAP.
I should precise, there is no proper funding in INRAP for that. So you are doing that because you are part also of the CNRS team and it's your will, but you are not paid for thinking on your data.
There is, it's quite a small funding, but it does exist in INRAP. It's mainly for editing papers. We have some funding. And we have another part of funding for this research, but with the goal of editing the results also.
It's rather limited.
Right, okay. Yes, that would be much the same here also. The other one that slightly interests me, I was wondering in terms of Enrico, whether, in terms of the high-level synthetic data approach, because one of the things that, for example, that there isn't much of Europe, but certainly in Britain now, is just vast amount of archaeology being done. Largely in the development market. And a lot of it is clearly enormously repetitive. And whether you see there's any sort of goal that, or responsibility in terms of beginning to start bridging issues of information redundancy. Because I certainly think for a lot of European archaeology, it's not localized to prehistory, that is increasingly becoming a problem. That people are just doing the same thing over and over again in the same way.
So when you mean, in this case, data redundancy, you mean in terms of procedure, in terms of type of data being collected?
Yes, the type of data we're collecting, it's very repetitive. You're just doing the same, and you're not doing anything different at each time when you're excavating.
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, I guess that opens to two things. One is, to some extent, redundancy in this case could be good, because if that leads to standardized practice and the same type of data being collected, that's the positive side.
Yeah.
Of course, the negative side is that, and that's, I think, the big challenge is that, as I said, the data are not collected for the same purpose as for the synthetic research, right?
Yeah.
So there's different objectives there, and it's always, the best solution is always collect the data keeping in mind what are the research questions. But of course there is a huge distance between the two, and it's not something that can be easily filled, partly because we don't have enough big synthetic, I mean, they are growing in terms of number of synthetic research projects, but they're not as common as we might think to inform and change the practice at the local level.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, to some extent, you don't also want this to be so driven by a specific research agenda, because that might, of course, go in the wrong direction.
Be limiting, yes.
And so I guess that will be always the problem. It's that things are happening at two different scales at two different moments in time, because of course one is coming after the other, and the time gap is often decades after.
Yes.
And so the important thing is always this communication, and it becomes the bigger is the data and the smaller is the amount of metadata, actually, the amount of metadata, let's put aside, but the bigger is the data, the more difficult is actually to go back to the original information and to retrieve that kind of metadata, as I said. I think there's a project in the US where they're trying to do so, and they've been struggling because you don't find the original excavator. You can contact the original excavator. The original excavator might not remember what was going on, or may not have that information. And in some cases, unfortunately, the excavator is dead, and the information is completely lost. And that has to come from both sides, in the sense that from the excavator side, there should be how I can make it in a way that this can be future-proof. But from the other side, there should be like promoting and raising the importance of CRM archaeology and showing how it's worth investing on that direction, rather than dismissing as, this is great literature, I'm going to do my academic excavation and ignore what's happening from CRM when the bulk of data is there.
It's being generated.
Yeah, so it's really how you facilitate this communication, and it's a big challenge because it's happening at different with different incentives at different scales, with different people often. So yes, that's what I probably want to open up in terms of discussion and how we can overcome this.
Okay, well I think on that note, if we open up for discussion and questions now, why don't we first do it on individual paper? Is there any individual questions for Fiona at this point? Yep.
Yes, I was wondering, so you have this high resolution records, 60,000 lithics and so on, but I'm still wondering whether you're not underexploiting the information that you retrieve from the material itself. It seems that what you project is basically the spatial distribution of finds, but I rarely see really an exploitation of the data in terms of, I don't know, site formation, taphonomy, or, so in terms of simply spatial statistics, these tools that you are basically embedded in GIS. So it seems that you're protecting just the things, the nice bits, basically that reflect a certain in situ chem structure, but there's no demonstration, a rejection that it might be somehow redeposited or post-deposit. There must be post-depositional factors going on. In order before assuming that everything you have is in situ, you should run a little bit some tests. And I think you have all the data, but I just feel that you're underexploiting the potential that you have there to discuss basically the evidence to make it even stronger.
Yes, well, actually, the work that was done on this site, as I said, it was for a Mesolithic excavation, Mesolithic site. So when we had to do the study, it wasn't adjusted for a complete study. As I said, we couldn't be exhaustive. In any case, we wanted to precise the chronology of each settlement the best we could, to be sure of the minimum, to point out the most evidence of the cultural, technological, typological of the characteristics of the assemblages. But we systematically precised the taphonomical context. So we always illustrated our approach to consider if it was homogeneous, a whole entity, a unique entity, archaeological entity, or if it could be mixed up with something else.
So how do you determine that, if it's mixed or homogeneous, based on which criteria? This is all my question about.
Well, we did some refittings, as I showed, but it couldn't be the most extensive. We just did some, as we didn't have a lot of time, and it was considering also for example, for the origination successive levels, it was the examining of the technological and typological criteria of the assemblages, how it was coherent or not.
Yes, this is mainly qualitative. So you're not exploiting fully the metrics you have on 60,000 lithics.
No, not at all. It's absolutely underexploited.
Okay.
And well, I've been asking for years for students to work on this site in l'équipe of ethnologie préhistorique also.
But who has access to
because
this
we really need to be to go beyond this first. It's 10 years later, but it's still a first approach of this site. And as I said, it's only last year that for myself I worked on the site again for 2 weeks, and that there is a PhD student working on the early Magdalenian. There is also a student who did how do you call it, memoir.
Master thesis?
Yes, master. In traceology on the 3 Aurignacian levels, and she will be this year doing, so it was on the Burins only for the first year, and so this year she will apply it on all the tools of one specific level. So the potential of information regarding the traceology is just huge, as it's well preserved on nearly all the settlements. So there's a large work to do on that also. And there are 2 people from Ethnologie Préhistorique who are working also on the Middle Magdalenian, on specific questions about the bladed productions. So it's Ludwig Mevel and Raphaël Angin. But yes, it's still 10 years later. That's the problem of such a big site found in rescue archaeology. It's what it becomes afterwards, and how to develop, because it was just some kind of first shot for the study.
Luke, following on from that, so what we seem to see with these kind of exquisite collections that seem to be rather discrete, and you say it's largely technological definitions and formations and things. So what are the questions you would ask of that data in terms of trying to get at formational processes and the different sorts of behaviour, or what are the kind of thing you could do with that kind of data?
Well, to demonstrate that it's in situ, you need to reject that it's not positionally removed.
Yeah.
So any feature that you would interpret it, because French archaeologists tend to see a lot of activity zones. So before pinpointing activity A, B, C, I think there's a lot of work to be done beforehand.
To demonstrate that they are, and they're not creations of this, yes. Yeah.
And so I was wondering, is there any ambition to make this data, even the most basic data, available publicly? Because it seems that just a few people over 15 years, it's really called route par route, so that people have access to the to the material itself. So, is there any ambition from INRAP to put these data somehow, to make them publicly available? Open access.
No, I've never heard of any open access by INRAP.
What is the ADS, Enrico? Does that take non-British data as well?
Yes.
And is that a model you think that works or doesn't work? Because I mean, it's a huge dilemma on all aspects, isn't it? At what stage do you want to? If you think in your head you might be working on the data, and
yes.
Of course there's a huge sense, or your students might want to work on the data.
Precisely.
There's a huge sense, therefore, that you don't want to make that data public. Well, the reality, of course, is 90% of the stuff we never do work on it. So it sits
Exactly. So that's the key thing. So there are, ADS, TDAR in the US. There are platforms where these data, and now we have even data paper that gives you extra information, but yet there hasn't been any major research that is, I found this data from ADS and I'm using it. So in one sense, one could say, don't worry about people using your data, because before they can come up with a good, interesting question, it will require some amount of time. So I would always say, just put on the ADS, and hopefully one day we'll have research that are entirely based on data recycling. But that leads also to the question why this is not happening yet. Because there are extraordinary data sets and they're just there.
It's extraordinary in many ways on the British scene, isn't it? But by and large, I agree. As far as I know, I haven't seen many research papers coming out where people have made use of the. I was on the board of ADS at one point, with all these, the golden age and how it was going to be made accessible. Whereas actually, something like the Portal Antiquity Scheme data collected by the public, collected by the public for totally non-research, well, totally different reasons, has of course been mined extensively, successfully by.
Because you've also seen, I mean, I don't know, in France, one of the trends is that idea that you, for sites like Heathrow Terminal 5, which is the idea that, you'll never really properly interpret the past, and you're making the database open and accessible that anybody can interpret it, which is actually also just generating not very good interpretation, but also no one's working with it at all. Most people actually working in archaeology have more data than they need anyways, and the idea that anybody has the leisure time to go excavate, reinterpret huge sites, they're not being drawn on. But it's perfectly true that the portable antiquities is being vastly utilised. Which is in fact exactly what Nathan Schlanger, did you see Nathan's paper on that, attacking the portable antiquities scheme?
I did never read it.
He attacked it particularly on the idea that generating the idea that the British Museum would endorse it, and it was in terms of Trump and Brexit politics, promoting a populism and debasing the idea of expertise, and that Britain was worse than anybody in Europe for that. So, particularly singling out the portable antiquities. Anyways, can we just move? Is there any other specific questions in terms of Enrico's paper? Comments?
Okay.
No, I think we said everything. So, is it worth talking a bit about the nature of tradition, I think, a bit? That would interest me. I mean, it's a little off the topic in terms of you, but in terms of the French background, but the sense of the state service, that the relationship of data, and also larger synthetic approaches, that seems to me potentially quite interesting in terms of, which you don't have in Britain at all. Britain is very much just, the synthetic study, synthetic use of data comes out of an strictly academic, not a state service. So how much does the sort of INRAP, in the sense of the more centralized service in France, generate higher levels of research?
The most often when it's a high level of research, it will still be, how to say that, it will be monographic publication of the study, a complete study of the site, but it's rarely going to be publication on a topic study, synthetic topic study. So it's there's good quality, very good quality of publications, but it remains still in the generating data that could be used by people like Enrico, and that we rarely go in that domain.
Right. But in terms of the basic organisation, I think probably we've only got like 5 minutes. It's not worth doing anything more serious about the British. But like in Britain, for example, you can't, the way it's set up, that in terms of the sites and monuments data, which is the basis of British data, and then you have the OASIS network that gets you, and you get through ADS. But you can't get distributional maps in Britain of prehistoric pottery types, for example. Those don't exist. You can't get it. You used to up to 2010, Bournemouth was producing it, but then that's lost its funding, so it stopped. And so, like, for example, one of the things in the Prehistoric Society, we have our student dissertation competition, and you can consistently see now that the nature of what students are doing in dissertation topics, it affects them because they can't get distributions. In later British prehistory, you can't get a distribution of Beaker. You can't get a distribution of any single type. And it's really clearly inhibiting research very badly. And when you talk to, and the trouble is it varies county by county, it's very chaotic, it's diverse sets of data, you cannot get your basic analysis out. So is it any better in France?
No, it seems to be better in France.
Excellent.
Yes.
It's nice, it's good for somebody.
Because we have the cultural heritage state services
Yes.
in each region, and they centralize everything that concerns archaeology.
Yeah.
So every new data is centralized by each regional service, and nearly every year they present the new finds with maps, and they have all the database of the location of a site. I don't know if their database includes specificities of each site, but it would be at least the chronology, if it's an enclosed farm or type of site. And so there is at least a minimum database that is always à jour. Update every year, and they present this data, and it's available for any student. So
Publicly accessible.
It's seen as
you can't access it online. You have to go physically to see them.
With a USB stick?
When we look at the book,
But it does exist.
Is it printed? Okay.
but it is seen as the greatest. I mean, universities in Britain are hugely concerned by the decline in applications by students to read archaeology, which is one of the huge threats, and there are many others like that. But on the other hand, so the biggest threat is government cuts, and therefore local authority cuts to all of that structure that Chris was describing. So the main records of what's been found from the past that are held in all our local government offices, which had at their best archaeologists on those local government payrolls, that it's been one of the casualties of austerity, is increasingly they're being contracted, and it's one of the huge debates for us about what we do in the future about that kind of memory of archaeological resource.
But it's actually a centralised error in Britain. That's the old thing, that we tried to get it into the revision of Oasis, that here are 100 basic types you needed to know the distribution of. And if ever was recorded each time that you simply had beaker pottery, you had coloured earth, that would make such a tremendous difference. And we couldn't get it through. The other thing where Britain is a problem, because it's very county-based, that how sites are recorded in the HER varies enormously. So that one of the big overview projects there has been the INGLAID, the English Landscape and Identities project by Chris Goslin's running in Oxford. There they've got the problem that they haven't been able to do is particularly the Northamptonshire data, because Northamptonshire are these notorious splitters of every single site. They subdivide everything. So every distribution plot that they generated on this vast project explodes in Northampton.
That's the Wyoming effect.
It is entirely, and it's totally unjustified. And that's, but they can't find a way to get around it. So it's a lingering problem. It really is a problem in terms of British data that it's not working at that centralised level.
And I think it was at the beginning of the 1990s that was organized in France, the archaeological mapping of France. So it is a tool that, it was conducted in every state service, archaeological state service. And so there was at least 3 or up to 3 to 5 people in each state service of each region working on collecting this data and put it in a database. And so now it's achieved, and we only add new data. Well, we don't, the state service does. And any archaeological excavation will be authorized by the state service. So it's all centralized in each regional state service. And also their mission is to gather all the archaeological collections, old, new, and make sure that they are correctly
how is the level of digitization of reports? So if I want to read an excavation report from a given site, is that mostly only in printed version? You have to go to the local council and find it, or is there any effort to make this?
If it's aged around up to 2000, it's paper.
Right. After 2000, it's all digital.
No.
Don't be like, wow.
I believe that from 2005, around that date, it should be digitized versions of it.
Okay.
And
Of everything?
when,
Okay. Of most, yeah.
yes, rescue archaeology, but
All the
also
digital format, yeah.
not rescue archaeology. How do you say that? Food programming. Every time you give a report in rescue archaeology or planned archaeology, you have to give to this state service a copy, digitalized copy of your database and the reports.
Talking about the general archaeological map of France, that is probably one of the results of the French archaeology being so empiric, as you can see from the two presentations. You have one presentation which is really empiric and the other one which is a bit more conceptual. That was my will, not to give too many credence for you two presentations, because I was guessing one would be very empiric and the other one would be very conceptual, and that's the results. I'm sorry not to have been wrong on that point, but I think that is not exaggerated to say that French archaeology is really, really, really very empiric. So sometimes it's a good thing because you have so many emphasis on data collection, fieldwork methods, computer recording, but that's also an approach which has many limits, because we have no time to think on data, and there is so little theory in a country where sociologists, anthropologists has had the flourishing development.
I mean, I think it's interesting because here that I've been involved in both of the sort of big data overview projects, and it's been interesting seeing the Gosden project and being sort of on the sidelines for that, because being Chris Gosden, it is a very interpretively driven, and it's a huge amount of resourcing that's gone into it. And as far as you can see, that after 5 years and 4 people full-time, unfortunately, nothing new has been found. Everything they talk about, everything they do, it could be Cyril Fox Highland Lowland Zone from the 1930s. It's totally predictable archaeology. Where the other one that has been a very different type of project has been the Reading Roman Rural Project, which has got moved across the country on a much cheaper scale, having these conferences and then 3 monthly conferences across them, limiting themselves to about 4,000 Roman sites in Britain, but constructing this really quite extraordinary database. And that's the only time I've been in an audience where you've had a big data moment. And there's been 2 or 3 out of it where suddenly everybody in the audience goes, oh, because you've suddenly seen a pattern that no one ever knew that was there. And it just opens all kinds of interpretive. I mean, one of them goes right through here, for example, that it's the idea that the Gaulish influence zone in cremation in the late Iron Age is then a determining factor in the early Roman period. And if you're into Roman archaeology, that's really important. And that opens all kinds of interpretive insights and possibilities, but it's only becoming because it's a very empirical project. And it's treating its data with a kind of seriousness, which is not just as an long-term interpretive tool, which the Gosden project, it's not saying there aren't interesting things coming out of the Gosden project, but one is clearly much more successful than the other. Well, I would have thought on that note, we could continue the discussion next door where there is wine. For those of you who have time.
That's an excellent suggestion.
And it's very appropriate. So I think we just thank our speakers and for the organization.